Hey guys, it's Aman
and Christina from
Our Rich Journey. Today we are talking about the beautiful small towns in Portugal and how to pick one if you decide to move to this beautiful country. Now you guys know that Christina and I have lived in Portugal for almost 4 years. In fact, we started out in Lisbon but eventually moved to a small town of our own. And in this video, we want to talk to you about some of the things that you should be considering if you are considering moving to Portugal and moving to one of the many villages that are just amazing. Now, before we get started, we want you guys to stay to the end of this video because we are going to list our favorite small towns in Portugal that you should definitely consider.
So if you're watching this video, you may be asking, what do we consider a small town? Because you have to keep in mind that Portugal has a total of 10 million people in it. So it's a relatively small country. Now, just to give you some perspective, the United States has 331 million people in it. And California, where we are from, has 39 million people in it. And if you look at something like LA, it has 3.8 million people in that city alone. So when you're looking at those numbers, Portugal is already considered a very small country. But we're talking about digging even deeper and getting into very small towns within Portugal. So when we're talking about the small towns, we're going to be excluding places like Lisbon and its metropolitan area, Porto, Coimbra, and Braga.
So when we are talking about small towns, we are talking about towns that are no more than 50,000 people living in that town, but they'll more likely be around 15 to 20,000. Now, one thing that's gonna surprise you is that when you're talking about a small town that has a population of, let's say, 15 to 20,000 people, depending on where you're from in the world, that may sound like a really small, tiny, sparse community. Maybe where you're from, a town that only has 15,000 people, they don't even have a stoplight or a library. But Portugal is very unique because you can have a town with only 15,000 people in it, and you could have the full range of amenities, including more than one stoplight. And in fact, there are towns like Nazaré, for example. That town only has about 15,000 people in it, but it feels like a bustling little city. It's near the coast. There's so much to do and see. And so the fact that there's only about 15,000 people in that town doesn't mean that it's a sleepy little town.
So we think the quality of life is just amazing in these small towns throughout Portugal. And so what we want to do now is focus on some of the things you should consider if you're looking for a small town in Portugal to move to. And the first one is housing. You really have to understand whether you want to rent or buy when you're here in Portugal. But if you move to these smaller towns, you have to understand that the rental supply in these smaller towns is going to be a lot lower. But the plus side to that is that you can find extremely affordable housing in these smaller towns, especially compared to the bigger cities in Portugal. So for example, in a small town, you can very easily find a 3-bedroom house that you can rent for example, €500 a month.
On the other hand, if you're going to buy a house, you are going to see a lot more inventory available to buy. We did a quick search of a small town called Fatima, and Fatima is a beautiful little city, and in Fatima, there were only 3 places to rent. Now, on the other hand, when you look to buy, there were over 120 listings for sale. The next thing to consider when picking a small town is transportation. If you're someone that likes to use public transportation, likes to use a metro or maybe the train to get around, you will have challenges if you move to a small town. More than likely, you will need a car. But there is a hack for dealing with this. There are certain small towns that have a central core where everything is located in this core and you don't need a car to maneuver around the core. And if you pick the right city that is connected to a regional train that can take you to Lisbon or to Porto, that is another form of transportation that you can rely on that wouldn't require you to get a car. But in our opinion, if you are going to move to a small town in Portugal, a car is a necessary thing to have.
So Aman mentioned the regional trains that can take you to the larger cities. There are also buses that go from city to city throughout Portugal, but that's something to keep in mind because a lot of people want to have that small town feel, but also want to be able to access these larger cities. So it's possible to live maybe 20 minutes outside of Lisbon or 20 minutes outside of Porto in these small towns, but also be able to access these larger cities.
Our next point is to consider your healthcare needs if you move to a small town. Now, most of these small towns have a little clinic. In fact, it's a community clinic within that small town. Our little village has one that we've been to, and the services are great. But sometimes those clinics cannot handle major issues. And so if you have certain medical conditions that require a certain level of medical attention, you should take this into account if you're picking a small town.
The next thing to consider is food.
Oh, yes.
You have to pay attention to your palate. So there are the bigger cities like Lisbon and Porto that have such a huge diversity of food. But if you go to these smaller towns, a lot of the restaurants that are available there are going to be focused primarily on traditional Portuguese foods. So if your favorite food is Thai or Mexican or Italian food, you may not be able to get that if you're in a smaller town unless you go from your smaller town to those larger towns.
But if you are a fan of Portuguese cuisine, which is amazing, the fish, the meat, just everything is so tasty. If you move to a small town, you will typically find the best food. I mean, it's like home cooking.
The next thing you want to consider are entertainment options. Now, a lot of people, when they come to a foreign country, they have a sense of things that they may want to do in that country. Maybe you enjoy hiking or swimming or going to the beach or all these other things that you may like as a hobby. So when you go to these small towns, you really have to understand whether or not these small towns that you want to move to have those types of entertainment or hobbies that can keep you busy.
Now, a really good example of this are the towns that are sprinkled along the coast. And I'll use Nazaré as an example because it's one of our favorite small towns. If you love surfing, if you are an outdoorsman type of person, Nazaré is the perfect place. Because year-round, you can do so many things that feed those interests and things that will just keep you stimulated. I mean, the fishing, the swimming, the surfing, it's just so many things to do if you are into the outdoors. Now, if you want to be at the discos and at the clubs, then maybe the city is more to your liking. You have to really understand how you want to spend your free time in these small towns. The next thing to consider is if you have children, where your children will go to school. Now, one thing about living in a big city, for example, is that a lot of the schools are crowded. There aren't a lot of spaces in many of the public schools. And in fact, a lot of the private schools are also impacted, and there are a lot of challenges with getting your kids into those schools. On the other hand, when you live in a smaller town, this isn't usually an issue. You're usually able to get your child into the daycare, into the elementary school, or the high school that is within that town.
And one other thing about the schools in these smaller towns, if you're looking to send your child to a private school, the private school fees are going to be a lot lower than what you would pay if you sent your child to a school in something like Porto or somewhere like Lisbon.
The next consideration is language. Now, I'm talking to my English speakers out there. And one thing about Portugal is that English is spoken throughout the country. You won't have a problem finding someone that speaks English. But in the smaller towns, there is less English spoken. Now, there's still some, but you may be in certain situations where you and that person may struggle to communicate. But you're going to be using a lot of sign language. You'll use an app like Google Translate. You will be able to get through it. Because one thing about Portugal is that people here are very patient and they appreciate when you try your best.
And so I would actually say that's a benefit to living in a small town. If you want to place yourself in situations where they may not speak English as much because you want to learn Portuguese and you want to be able to practice your Portuguese, the best way to do that is to surround yourself with people that actually speak none of the language that you speak, because then you can't revert to that when it gets difficult.
And this brings us to our last point about moving to a small town in Portugal. And this is something that we are so grateful for. It is the sense of community that you will find in the smaller towns. Now, when we lived in a big city like Lisbon, our neighborhood had its own personality, but people were always coming and going, and it was a very fast-paced environment. On the other hand, living here in the countryside in our small community, people really take the time to get to know you. Our neighbors come over, they bring us things, we take things to our neighbors. Everyone within this community knows each other very well, and they're always looking out for one another.
So if you're the type of person who likes that sort of small town feel where you go into the grocery store and you see the same people, where neighbors go walking together, where you really feel a sense of community, you know everyone in your town and they know you, then a small town here in Portugal is definitely something that you should consider. So now that we've given you all these different things to consider, we want to give you a quick list of some of the small towns that we think that you should look into. Now, we've been to all these small towns, we love them, but you have to do your own research. Look into these places and see if they may be the small town fit that you're looking for. So we have Nazaré, Peniche, Figueiró da Foz, Tomar, Ortigosa, Caldas da Rainha, and Fatima.
So that is just a brief list, and most of those are on the Silver Coast of Portugal, as a matter of fact. But there are tons of great small towns down in the Algarve and up near Braga and Porto that you really have to just go visit, spend a couple of nights there to really get a feel for what life would be like there. And so if you guys have liked this video, as usual, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and join the journey.